Welcome to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years, online at thepulp.net. This Pulp Event podcast looks at traveling through time with H.G. Wells, popular culture professor Garyn Roberts, who was awarded the Muncie in 2013, examines Wells's appearances in Amazing Stories magazine. The presentation featured numerous examples of covers from Amazing Stories. Visit the Pulp Event podcast page at the PulpNet for a link to a gallery of covers. This was recorded on July 21st, 2016, at PulpFest 2016 in Columbus, Ohio.
The thing about the illustrations we're going to see from the pulps today, some are primarily their exterior pictures, but there's some interior ones as well, some line drawings, some by Frank Paul, some by other people. Probably many of us have seen a number of these images in one context or another, and they're a great deal of fun. A lot of interesting things going on them, even with the very first issue, which we'll see in just a minute or two here. With H.G. Wells, there are scholars infinitely more studied on the topic than me. The life of Wells, which spanned about, 80 years, was literally, without pulling out the puns or cliches or whatever, was literally amazing. It was phenomenal. And so our focus tonight, not only the fact that he would have turned 150 next month, it's also on his Amazing Stories appearances. And what I came to find out, I knew about these, as Mike suggested, was that they were actually much more profound in American culture than I initially had envisioned. And maybe we'll see some of that as we go along here. I was telling somebody today, in some of your best studies and scholarship and research and all that kind of thing, something sort of emerges out of it that you didn't initially intend. And I think that happens a little bit in what I found here, at least in my limited experience with Wells. Probably one of the very best, if not the best scholars on H.G. Wells was a gentleman that lived almost 100 years. He published almost 70 decades, was a friend of PulpCon and PulpFest, and that's the late Dr. Jack Williamson. And Jack Williamson in the 1930s, when he did his doctoral dissertation, and you probably know what a dissertation is a book-length study. The book writing is no problem. It's the 7 or 8 cranky professors who don't like each other who take it out on your writing. That's what the doctoral dissertation is. All I can tell you about that. Okay. Jack Williamson knew H.G. Wells. He was considered in the 1930s as a young man, that being Williamson, one of the top scholars on Wells. And so when I think of all the different things that have been done and not done, I think of the guy that Steve Hafner celebrates in his press and that others of us have come to like through the years, that being Jack Williamson. Okay, so 150 years of H.G. Wells, 90 years of Amazing Stories, and we come to find out some interesting things here. Our focus here, with the big breadth of what was the life, and a very, very varied and complex life of H.G. Wells, is in the mid-1920s, what we're talking about today, because, of course, we're interested in not only Wells, but the Amazing Stories era. And for lack of a better term, this is good stuff. Okay? I'll read some of this just real quickly. One of the big things you don't do in PowerPoint is put a lot of print, so, of course, they start out with a couple slides of print. Wells lived from September 21st, 1866, right after the Civil War in this country. Of course, he was English, to August 13th, 1946. So he had seen the conclusion of World War II during his lifetime. He published many, many things, a variety of things, and some of those that you would remember or see or hear, and we'll revisit some of these tonight, were The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, okay, many, many others. And as Mike was telling us here at the beginning, the first 29 issues of Amazing Stories not only featured H.G. Wells stories, but he appeared on every one of those covers. Nobody else ever was able to do that. And so there were 28 issues plus the first quarterly, the winter 1928. That would have been right about the time my dad was born, who's still with me, I'm very glad to say, to April 26. Now, as Mike also suggested, Gernsback was still in control of Amazing Stories, and what we'll probably learn tomorrow, there's some other great, much better than my presentations on Amazing Stories coming up, although I've published a few things on Gernsback through the years for literary dictionaries and things like that. What we come to find out, and many of us know, is that Gernsback would ultimately lose control of Amazing Stories just after the first few years of his brainchild. That's a very interesting story in itself. We won't go off on those details right now. Okay, let's look at some things here. Here's the quote that I kind of like, kind of emerges from this whole thing about Wells and Amazing Stories. There was a very famous Canadian professor from the University of Toronto, and probably many of you have heard his name. His name was Marshall McLuhan. Somewhat controversial in the 60s and 70s, but boy, he was worth thinking about. His theories were very, very interesting. One of his big theories, which I think is fascinating and has tremendous merit, was the theory he called the theory of rearview mirrorism. And that was with the emergence of each new story type, each new genre, each new media form, the new medium or story type would draw on the best successes, the most profitable successes of the previous medium to guarantee at least some market share. So if you stop and think about it, some of the very first pulp magazines were what? Tony Tolan was telling us a little while ago, reminding us about Street and Smith originally started out as a dime novel publisher. Not many dime novel publishers other than Street and Smith actually made the transition to pulps. But a lot of the early pulp stories were the very most successful stories of dime novels, especially in things like westerns and detective fiction. Okay, early television, 1948 network television, somewhere in there for people who could get it in the bigger cities, was what? It was reinterpretations and successes of famous radio shows like Suspense and others, right? The concept of going back and creating some guaranteed kind of market. Well, this is what Gernsback did in Amazing Stories. And he plastered Wells' name on the cover of each of those first 28 plus the quarterly issues. Okay? So it's interesting. Here's a quote that sort of says what he meant by rearview mirrorism. It says, when faced with a totally new situation, we tend always to attach ourselves to the objects, to the flavor of the most recent past. We looked at the present through a rearview mirror. We march backwards into the future. And as I've thought about this through the years, this is really, I think, very, very profound about media history, and it certainly applies to pulps. This was Wells at the time of his real creativity in terms of speculative fiction. Now, we know that the term science fiction wouldn't be coined until about 1930. We can read scholars like Sam Moskowitz and others who can tell you where the term came from. And all of that, prior to that, it was speculative fiction, scientific romance, and all kinds of other things. But this is what Wells looked like in the late 1800s as he's writing these stories, the 1880s to 1890s. Now, these stories would originally appear in British magazines that were a little bit more slick than what we call pulp magazines. And Mike has a great thing on all our website stuff about where the term pulp comes from, name for the coarse pulpwood, acidic-laden paper, all that kind of stuff. But he's writing for a little bit more slicker quality, if we can take a kind of an aesthetic evaluation and unfortunate judgment, which I don't always like, saying that one medium is better than another. But this is what he looked like. Okay, but that's not what he looked like when this stuff would appear in Amazing Stories. Okay, here's the first one. We've all seen this archetypal cover. I saw recently, in fact, I just bought a copy online. I think it was a mere $8 or something. Somebody did a facsimile edition of this volume. And if I can be so ornery, I'm very good at being ornery, I would give the reprint quality about a B average. It was really neat. It had everything I liked. It's facsimile, the whole deal. but they didn't clean up the pages. It is real dark, and anybody who knows how to work a copy machine knows how to take the darkness out of yellowed pages. But anyway, that is available via Amazon. This issue has always fascinated me for one very significant pet peeve that I had for 34 years as a professor. I'm not that old, believe it or not. I started when I was 22. There's something on this cover that really irks the living hell out of me, if I can say so. Can you see what it is from where you're sitting? What's that? Nope. Nope, that's good though, but what is it? Can you? Nope. It has nothing to do with the illustration or with the colors. Nope, I love Jules Verne. Nope. Why the hell can't anybody spell Edgar Allan Poe's name correctly? I don't expect you to be able to see it. It's Allen. No. You know, it's like you put up the crucifix in front of the vampire. No, that's not how Poe spelled. The greatest American, here's some opinion for you, the greatest American writer that ever lived was more instrumental in different types of genre writing, journalism, criticism, science fiction, mystery fiction, horror fiction, and you can't spell his name right? Oh my, but you know what? This isn't the only time it happens. This is what the interior illustration looked like for the first reprint in Amazing Stories. And again, Gernsback had to have some kind of a deal or pay for this stuff, but what brilliance on his part to use this concept of rearview mirrorism to really establish science fiction in this country. Again, in 1926, we didn't have a name for it in this country yet, science fiction. The term wasn't coined. And so he's doing this, you know. And prior to this time, we all knew about the archetypal quintessential Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. And by the way, as our gentleman here, Michael, who won the prize tonight, pointed out before the presentation, sometimes variants and stories are better than the original. You know the story about Mary Shelley, right? When she first did the story between 1816 and 1818, it was a rip-snorting great story that pulp fans would have loved, right? In fact, it's my favorite of the two versions. By 1831, she does a second version, right? She's taken herself a little too seriously, and she thinks she's literate with a capital L, right? I love Mary Shelley, don't get me wrong, but it's best to read the old version and compare it to the new one, because the old one has, you know what they say about Mickey Spillane? I was listening to him talk before his death out in New York City. And from 1947 to 1952, he had 7 of the 10 best-selling books in the world in that period of about 5 years. And some smart ass in the crowd asked him, we're sitting out there in Manhattan at some big hotel for the Edgar Awards. I happened to be nominated for one that year. I was very blessed. Somebody said, well, why didn't you get the other 3, Mick? He said, because I only wrote 7 novels during those 5 years, you know? But there's something that happens with, and you hear other writers talk about this as well, like a very successful friend of mine, Max Collins or whatever, that they start out with this tremendous, and I don't want to get off the topic too much, this tremendous vitality and energy, and then somebody tells them they're literate and they need to clean up their craft, right? In an effort to attain art. Well, it doesn't work that way, and some of the very best stuff is the oldest stuff. Somebody said to Raymond Chandler one day, what if you took all those red herrings and misconnections out of the big sleep? And he said, there'd be no novel. He said there'd be nothing left. Yeah. So, okay, let's look at some H.G. Wells. And the second issue, The Crystal Egg, is a wonderful story. It's a short story. I like it. You might like it because it starts out in an antique store, right? Great fun, and there's this crystal egg that is this portal to, well, I won't wreck the story. You got to read it. There's Edgar Allan Poe again. Not the Poe I know, but some Poe is on the cover. We should mention Jules Verne, okay? Jules Verne, tremendous, very prolific French author. We know this, right? And we know that most of Verne's stuff, even though he's remembered today for some really interesting science fiction material, I love it all. I really love the Verne stuff, and there's some really wonderful reprints being done with nice, clean translations the last 20 years. And the Verne Society has been instrumental in supporting that. But the vast majority of Verne stuff was adventure fiction, right? 70-80% of all the stuff he wrote was adventure fiction. And so there's Wells again. And some great stories on this particular issue. Another very famous archetypal cover. There's an interior illustration from the crystal egg. And again, we've seen a lot of these pictures before. There's the star. You know the short story, The Star? I think it really must have influenced the later novel by When Worlds Collide. Okay, it's about the impending doom. There's a star and everybody's... And there was a great time tunnel episode based on that one time, too, set in a Welsh mining community, and they think the world's going to end. This is sort of the beginning of all that kind of story for him. Wells was really important, not only in his earlier days in England, but in his reprints, in terms of articulating all kinds of different types and variants of science fiction. So you had the time travel story, you had the Lost World, you had all kinds of things. You had the mad scientist story, you had the invasion story, and it's pretty neat stuff, for lack of a better term. It's pretty neat, you know. Very readable, very, very readable. Did you know that in 1900, and this has astounded me for 20, 30 years, in 1900, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, H.G. Wells was considered the smartest, most important social thinker in all the world. And you think about 1900, there must have been some pretty smart ladies and men at that time, right? But worldwide, he was considered. So it wasn't just his science fiction. He wrote The Outline of History. He wrote incredible things. He was very much respected. But in 1900, he was considered the smartest man overall on the planet. How do you judge that? I don't know. It's a matter of subjectivity and opinion. But that was popular belief back then. Oh, big bug. Science gone bad. This is just wonderful stuff. Jules Verne again. Wells on the cover. You can't see it there very well again. Well, this is also a very good story, The Empire of the Ants. I saw in the dealer's room tonight as we're setting up that there were several dealers had some really nice editions, quite affordable collections of Wells short stories, and some of them you don't always see, but they're fun, they're good. Empire of the Ants, good material. Making sure I don't pace myself on the time here a little bit. There's Verne again, and there's H.G. Wells. Yeah. So the more and more I looked at this, I thought, it's becoming really apparent. We had some really neat reprints and some great authors. There were authors in this country that wrote some really wonderful speculative fiction. There was one guy who's so often forgotten, and Sam Moskowitz did a collection of his stories, was a guy by the name of Edward Page Mitchell. And he wrote for the newspapers and stuff in the late 1800s, and he was really kind of an American version of Wells. A lost master, very prolific, very important. But it just seems to me that in terms of the word archetype, an archetype meaning not necessarily the first, but the model upon which everything else is based. So Sherlock Holmes is the archetype of a classical detective fiction, right? He's not the first, but he is the one that is the measuring stick for everybody else. Wells provides kind of the archetype in his fiction of science fiction. And he really, from across the pond, so to speak, gets American science fiction underway thanks to the insight of Hugo Gernsback. Gernsback's story is fascinating. If you ever want to read his biographies and where he came from and how he was an immigrant and he was trying to sell batteries via catalogs and that kind of thing when he first started, modern electrics and all that stuff. You ever read about his history? And he realized that his batteries sold better in the catalogs if he included some sort of fact-based science story. Yeah, it's very, very interesting stuff. And then Bernard McFadden becomes kind of the monster, if I can say the word Antichrist, right? And he becomes the big guy who causes a lot of grief for Gernsback. In the Abyss. So here's where the fan comes out in me. I just start getting all excited. Tell me this isn't a cool picture. This is really neat stuff. This is what Wells would have looked like at the time of the reprints. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine. And so that's right about when all this is going on. You gotta love the big bug motif, right? Boy, they would do that for years in the 1950s movies. This is the first installment of The Island of Dr. Moreau. And again, Wells is on every one of these covers. That's the second part. Here's a couple of interior pictures of some of the creatures and results of Dr. Moreau's less than ethical scientific practices. First Men in the Moon. In a few cases, Gernsback serialized some of the novels of Wells in the 1920s. I'm trying to remember who else is in this issue. There was a really neat, again, there's that word I'm overusing, neat, really wonderful lady from Illinois, and not a real lot is known about her. We're discovering more and more, who published in Amazing Stories. You know who I'm talking about? This is the one I think that has the fate of the Poseidonia in it. Claire Winger Harris. She was a housewife in northern Illinois. And in the 20s, Forey Ackerman was the one who put me onto her, and I just fell in love with her story and her personal story, and then her writing. And I think this has the fate of Poseidonia in it. Good issues from cover to cover. Murray Leinster. It's pronounced Leinster, not Leinster. I learned that this summer. I was fortunate. Tom Roberts has me doing, it's due out this fall. We just finished an adventure collection of Murray Leinster's very first stuff before he did science fiction. His real name was Will Jenkins. But there's, you know, it's the first Men in the Moon, but there's a kind of an invisible man back there too, you know. This has a Burroughs story in it. Wow. Wells on all these covers. First Men in the Moon. Before we go any further, I need to thank Chuck Welch for his excellent work at translating all this stuff. We sent it to him electronically, and he got it in real good shape for us, given what the material was I sent him. Yeah, oh man. And I know you've seen some of these pictures, right? Some of them are like old friends and stuff, but H.G. Wells again. Burroughs is starting to show up, and his stuff is not reprints at this point. A. Merritt. Okay, probably some stuff from Argosy. I don't know what the Merritt story is in there. There's a time machine. And if I remember correctly, this is the whole novel in this one. They didn't serialize this thing. They put the whole thing in there. Time machine. Wells again. That's a short story. The story of the late Mr. Elvesham. Wells again. Merritt is showing up here. The Plattner story. And of course, that's the picture that's on your, the one we're wearing around our necks, right? If I haven't lost it already. There it is on the floor. Now, where do you see this on a weekly basis on TV? The Big Bang Theory, sure. This very illustration, this Frank R. Paul thing is in Sheldon and Leonard's house, right? Their apartment. All right, so it made the cover there. Here it's not on the cover. Now somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't this one of the pieces of art from the Bob Lesser thing when we were in Bowling Green all those years ago? One of the originals? I may be making it up there on that one, so don't hold me to that. Do you remember some of us older timers? We're not that old, but when we were up in Bowling Green, must have been 20, 25 years ago, and had all that great Robert Lesser stuff. Bob is still selling pulps over in England. I bought one from him a month or so ago. What were the worlds? Interesting story. Of course, we know that H.G. Wells was not related to Orson Welles. In fact, they even spelled their last names differently, right? But before he died in 1946, H.G. Wells met Orson Welles, and they did quite a lengthy radio show together. Have any of you ever heard that? Yes. Yeah, it's actually very, very good. And what I like about it is it goes on for a while. It's just not a short little, here he is, shake hands, goodbye. They actually, and there was kind of a mutual admiration society between the two of them. They got along very well. And of course, Orson Welles' story is fascinating as well. Tony mentioned A Touch of Evil a little while ago, one of many H.G. Wells, Orson Welles movies. But they weren't related, but there was this kind of this landmark meeting of the two of them in the last years of H.G. Wells' life. Cummings, Garrett Smith. Thanks to some pulp reprinters, again like Black Dog and others, we're getting to see some more of that old lost Gene Christie and Tom Roberts and all the rest of them. Ray Cummings stuff and some Garrett Smith stuff, and that's all right. It's good stuff. And Gernsback's still on the masthead there. It's a wonderful cover. Story of the Stone Age is in that one. Wells is still on the cover. Boy, I don't know. That reminds me of a modern type movie. I don't know, like something like, I won't even say it, like The Matrix or something like that. The Country of the Blind. Very, very famous story with some famous lines, quotes that people quote to this day out of it, you know. But here's Wells, and he's tightening up and bringing together some traditions and Americanizing, you know, what we had. And there was stuff in Argosy. We're going to hear about that some more tomorrow, right? I know Doug Ellis and others have some things to say. And I don't know. I can sit here and look at these pictures over and over again, and they're fascinating. Here's stuff when the sleeper awakes. Okay. The Winter, actually it was issued in January of 1928. And by now, Jack Williamson had been reading Amazing Stories for a good year or so. He picked it up with just a couple of issues into the run off the newsstand as a fairly young man. He was born in 1908. And wow, good stuff. And of course, this story's been reprinted many times in hardcover and trade paperback and all that kind of stuff. Pollock and the Poro Man. This cover is always, that's a very good story, by the way. The Flowering of the Strange Orchid, that's one you want to read as well. You know, the temptation for me is, oh, this is about that one. I don't want to wreck the stories for you. But you got to read them. They're very, very good. Very, very good. But this one has always the cover has fascinated me a little bit because we've got the Oriental Asian thing going here. And of course, you know, part of the era, we're certainly not justifying it or whatever, but it was part of the reality of the day, the image of the stereotype of the yellow peril, the yellow menace, and all that kind of stuff. By the way, stop by Bill Maynard's table tomorrow. He's got the great stuff, I'm telling you. Fu Manchu and a lot of the imitators and all that. Plus, we've discovered today that Bill's son looks a lot like Sax Rohmer in his early. Check that out. It's a little spooky. I said to Bill, if Mike starts sending you postcards from Limehouse, you might get a little worried, you know. But this one has always fascinated me. This cover, I don't know what to make of it, and it intrigues me, you know. But anyway, look at the beauty in that. See over there, we still don't have exactly the term science fiction. Gernsback has gotten us to science fiction, okay, but we're still not quite there. And now we're joined by David Keller. Such wonderful stories and folklore, some of it probably even true about all these people, you know. Story of Days to Come. Let's see, was that the one there too? Yeah, that's part one. Here's part two. Great Monster. The Invisible Man, one of two. That was broken into 2 issues. July 28th. Now we're coming down to the very end of Wells, and what happens then, let's see, we go, this is this famous cover. What's interesting about this cover, do you know, or in this issue? Well, I don't know if that's it or not, but there's a misconception about this. That's not Buck Rogers. That's the first Buck Rogers story by Francis Nolan, but that's an illustration from the Doc Smith story. You got time for a quick Doc Smith story? Oh man, this is a good one. So you know, Doc Smith was a very bright man. Well, he had a doctorate and all this kind of stuff. He was a scientist. He was tremendously talented. And this is a true story. In the heart of the Depression in Michigan, I'd lived in Michigan for lots of years, a wonderful state. I know we're in Ohio now. I lived in Ohio too, and I love Ohio. So, you know, no worries there. But there was a donut company in the 1930s called, and I don't think it's around anymore. It was when I first lived in Michigan, but the last 10 years or so we lived there, I don't think it was there anymore. It's called Dawn Donuts. And in the height of the Depression in the 30s, when $5,000 was worth having, it still is today, by the way, but back then it was really significant, Dawn Donuts came to Doc Smith and they said, we want you as a chemist to create the formula that's going to get our franchise off the ground. And he did. He made the formula for Dawn. See, that had nothing to do with anything, but it's kind of interesting story, isn't it? Yeah. The moth. It's a funny thing. You know, we sometimes canonize authors, James Fenimore Cooper with The Frontier, the romantic story, you know, we canonize the Poes and all these people, but sometimes we should actually read them. Wells is another person that said, oh yeah, H.G. Wells, he was great, don't know much about him. We've seen a couple movie adaptations. Time Machine is really great with Rod Taylor, and it is a good film. And the Time Machine is in one of the Big Bang episodes and all this and that. But Wells is one of those people that you really should read, not just because they tell you to or because he's canonized and he's great. He really was. You go back and read him and he's just really fun. Okay, this is one of our last pictures. This is the first time, the 30th issue of Amazing Stories, that H.G. Wells does not appear on the cover or in its pages. Now, there's something going on in Amazing Stories at this time, and I'm sure the gentleman we're going to hear tomorrow talk about the early days of Amazing Stories will probably address some of this. But Gernsback is struggling here because he wants his stories to be scientifically based. They have to, in his mind, have some kind of basis in reality, some plausible way of thinking that they could actually happen, right? And so he's insisting, and what he does is he hires a number of medical and military people, Dr. David Keller, there's other ones, Miles Brewer, who's a doctor, so on and so forth, to add this scientific credibility with their names. And he puts the initials after their names, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And he's really struggling with it. And here in this first issue after the Wells era, it's like there's this transition gonna happen where he's gonna have to really fight and reemphasize, fight for this idea that there would have to be equal fact with the theory. There had to be some legitimate science in it. But he himself knew, and he had other magazines, and he wrote stories himself that were highly fantastic. He knew that stuff sold, but he had kind of a conflict within himself, being a scientist himself in real life, this being Gernsback, the marketer of different kinds of batteries, the guy who had been born and raised in Luxembourg and had migrated to New York. But there it is. That's the first issue where he's not in there. There's some kind of change happening. It wouldn't be much longer. I couldn't tell you the exact date, but it's within a few months that Gernsback would lose control of the magazine. Okay, that is more than enough for me. Does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to add or say? Or yes, go ahead, please. I'm supposed to remember your name. Would you tell me, please, again?
You know me from
I sure do. For years, yeah.
I just wanted to say, if somebody is really a fan of H.G. Wells and the pulps, they should get a hold of Peter Heining's the H.G. Wells scrap.
Yes.
You know about that one?
I own it, yes.
Okay, it's full of all sorts of illustrations from his books as well as different things from his life. And it has lots and lots of wonderful pulp interior illustrations. Especially my favorites are the ones by Lawrence Stern Stevens, which I wish somebody would do a book on. I mean, people do new books on Finlay and other people.
Sure, right.
And some people say he's derivative of Finlay, but I don't care. It's wonderful stuff. He did so much stuff of Wells, and it was of such high quality.
Yes.
So I heartily recommend
It is.
I do have two questions for you, though, especially
Sure.
since you're an academic. A few years ago, I blundered across, while I was going through Melcat, the electronic earlobe
That's right.
system of the state of Michigan, I came across all these annotated editions of H.G. Wells, many of which did have illustrations as well, but they were by a guy named Leon Stover.
Yes.
Apparently, okay, you
No.
say that was a...
Yes, I don't know him well, but my impressions have not been good, if I may be opinionated.
Okay, I know he was really into Heinlein, and I got the impression he leaned toward being libertarian, and yet he did all these interesting, seemingly unbiased, most of the time, annotated editions of Wells, which surprised me because Wells started out being something of a hardcore socialist and eventually became more of a democratic socialist. But they seemed quite interesting, and they seemed quite, I don't know, nonpartisan, unbiased, whatever. And you seem to have a rather negative impression of Stover, as I might have gotten from some things I've heard about his other work. But
Sure.
I don't know if you've seen these actual annotated. I'd be interested.
Pretty good stuff, huh?
Well, I would be. You obviously are an academic.
Doesn't mean a whole lot all the time.
In knowing your opinion, like a year from now, if you were to get your hands on these things and take a look at them yourself. And also, there's an H.G. Wells Society in Britain. There used to be an H.G. Wells Society of the United States. In fact, I was going to join it a few months ago before my health broke, and all these things I was going to do to prepare for PulpFest just got aside. I don't know if you know anything about that.
I don't, but it'd be...
They have quite a few publications, and they still put stuff out now. Of course, they're having a big year right now because it's the 150th.
That's right.
The 70th of his death.
Right.
And I'm just curious as to what happens to the U.S. one. I was thinking it'd be wonderful if you could revive it. Maybe even hear the way the farmer people have their little something.
I love the farmer people.
Wells had such an important influence
Yeah,
on the pulp.
absolutely.
So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, it's good stuff. And off on the tangent, the society that I really think is wonderful these days is the Jules Verne Society. Those folks are top rate. The work they're doing is the best that's maybe ever been done on Verne.
I've heard about them. I'd like to hear more about that, please.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say about Wells, and that is that I am by no means any expert on Wells. I'm as much of a fan as anything, and I know about the early days of Amazing Stories, but there are a lot of people, including the late Dr. Williamson and other experts who know a lot more. But I love Peter Haining. I love his collections. I know some people might disagree with me, but he came up with the greatest stuff, and his Wells scrapbook is a dandy book. It's about like that, yeah. Anybody else have any questions? You say, oh, you just made that all up. You're full of nonsense. No, I actually believe all that stuff that I told you. Life is too short to make it up. So, yeah, I think it's very interesting. Just the last thing or so to say is that I think it's really a stroke of genius on the part of Hugo Gernsback to draw on the legacy of Wells to really launch science fiction in this country. And that concept, once again, of rearview mirrorism by Marshall McLuhan is really kind of, well, not to exaggerate, but it gives me chills. I think it's got a lot of merit to it in terms of media theory. Okay, well, thank you very much. You've been really wonderful. Thank you, Mike.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. The Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2016.